Hello and welcome to episode number 9 of our podcast. My name is Elliot Greenman.
I'm Alexis Enel.
And this podcast is all about some definitions of some words that we've been using.
Where we struggled a bit and we looked on Google to look at exactly what it meant. We were not too far off those things, but we use quite a lot of words who have quite a broad definition, and we needed to make it a bit clearer to all of you on our podcast, basically. So, it's an interesting one. Indeed.
Yep.
Again.
Yep. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or want to like it or want to share it, please feel free to do so.
Yeah. We like human interaction again. Yeah.
Always. And enjoy.
Bye.
Perambulations in franglais.
Cool. So let's talk about these definitions.
Yes, that was the main jig of things, really, to try to define a few words that we use on a regular basis. So we've done that online course about persistent pain versus acute pain, and it took us a couple of hours to really go in depth with that, really, and because that's what we are really interested in, really, and it encompasses quite a few words that have really quite specific meanings in a way.
You can come a little bit further away from it.
Yeah. And
so the words we spoke about.
Well, there was like humanism, which we talk a little bit about, and that humanistic approach that we have, which is like really a patient-centered approach. It's about the experience the person has, and the fact that he can use his reason to actually find the solution to the problem in a way, really. So, but it's really centered on the person. It's not like a group type thing, or like a cult or a religion or something like that. It's really more about
focused,
patient-centered or client-centered or human-centered.
So is humanism is like the psychology or like the practice of individual
of being exactly. So I think there's individualism into it as well. The fact that, a lot of your rights and I'm not even too sure how to say that really properly, really articulate it really well, really. But there's in the law as well of the land, we are judged by others, and we have a certain rights to be innocent before proven guilty, all those kind of things, really. So there's quite a lot of focus on that individual rights as well, with that humanism part of things, really, which is a bit under threat at the moment with all the group identity movement there is, with all that radical left a bit, which actually talks about, which subdivides and group people is a collectivist type thing, really. Who dare you to speak out on your own when actually you're part of a subgroup and a class and a gender and a diet and a type of training, and you do functional rehabilitation, and I do paleo diet, and I'm a vegan, and I'm a non-binary person. Yeah. So we belong to groups like that, but actually it's an interesting way of doing it differently. The humanistic stuff talks about you as an individual, basically, and all what it encompasses, basically.
How's individualism different from humanism? Or is it?
I'm not exactly sure. Okay. It must be a bit... Humanism must be... Individualism must be part of humanism.
Yeah. So
type thing, really.
I got the Oracle, consulted the Oracle Google.
Yeah.
Humanism, the noun is described as a rationalist outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters.
That's it. So it's a rational thing.
Yeah.
So you use your rational mind basically, and it predicates the fact that you are able to use your rational mind. You know, when we do the human givens, in the human givens, you got one of that resource you have is your rational mind. And one of the resource you have is your imagination. Those kind of things, really. And the two.
And you do actually have those two resources, but sometimes you only have one.
And you get access to one. So after we could talk, I think we talked quite a fair bit about catextia, because I think there was quite a lot of criticism in recent century, let's call it like that, or maybe middle of the 1800s, about, or maybe even before in the 1700s as well, with that humanistic type thing about the rational aspect of it. Are we able to be rational? That was a whole problem, really, a bit, really. And obviously there's that catextic, which Joe Griffin and Ivan Tyrrell have coined that term, which is the arousal level you are under tends to limit your ability to use your reason. And or actually not so much that way, but it actually blinkers you and it restricts the field of thought you could have in order to articulate your thought, basically. I think that's maybe a bit better way of describing the whole thing. I might make a bodge of it again on defining the whole thing, but I think it's really that tunnel vision that prevents you from being very rational, and you get a bit black and white in your way of thinking instead of being grey or light grey or dark grey, whatever already, okay?
Or maybe a little bit of colour.
Oh yeah. Oh, black and white
Yeah.
type thing. Really, there could be some color as well. Yeah, and it would be that would be maybe bringing your imagination into the world, because out of white there's all the colors, and out of black there's no color, because black and white are not color anyway. Black and white are not colors.
White's all colour.
They are
and
valors.
black's the absent.
They are valors, I think. That's what they call them. Anyway, so the catextia part of it is preventing us to really be too reasonable, basically, and too rational, and using our rational mind a little bit, okay? And that arousal level from a bit of flight and fright engagement tends to has worked very well to try to make us survive in certain dangerous and life-threatening situations, because we had a tunnel vision and we would watch just the one tree and we would not get distracted when the saber-toothed lion was actually after us, basically, and we would just focus on the escape plan instead of being distracted by the daisies and the dandelions and how fluffy the clouds were on the day, and it was smelling really nicely of cherry blossom today, and then it would be eaten, basically. So it was quite an interesting way to actually function, and we've been bred out of getting not focused enough when we were aroused, basically.
Can you be catextic on the other end? So
that's it.
Too contextually blind to being rational, so you're like way too
imaginative. That's it.
Or like psychotic as.
That's it. And schizoid a little bit. So you could maybe be it would be far too difficult for you to focus onto something. So your view is far too broad, and you're not able to focus on it, because I guess the catexia is to maybe preventing you from going in and out of focus with your mind onto things, really. So a problem needs to be, you need to focus on one thing to get as much definition as possible on the whole problematic, and then being able to step back to re-look at the problem a bit, because otherwise you lose focus on the whole thing, really, and then you refocus on another part of it, and then you come back of it, and then that enables you to really articulate it precisely at a very high definition definition pattern really, which is what we are trying to do with some of the course a little bit in that heuristic fashion. So we are trying to have a loose approach to help people, to guide people to get that experiment for them to be able to get a bit better with their persistent pain, and we framework it a little bit, and we guide them in following that pain gate model, and it enables them to use whatever resources they have at their disposal. They don't have to follow our model to the letter, basically. So they've got a little bit of leeway to be able to reopen the whole lot and be quite imaginative about how they're going to do it, really. Okay? Mm-hmm. Which I think is the definition of heuristic, basically. That loosely ruled experiment, a little bit, that enables you to learn about yourself, maybe. Or about to learn I think it's a learning process that is done, and a scientific process that could be done with certain rules which are not too restrictive.
It's almost like energy saving.
Yeah. Oh, so yeah. Yes, like that's it.
So it's like enabling that Google.
Yeah.
The Oracle says, enabling a person to discover or learn something for themselves.
That's it, for themselves. That's it.
So heuristic process or method is kind of like you almost have these methods to prevent you from
like diverging too far and losing track of what you're trying to achieve, and therefore you need to be brought back in focus a little bit, but not too stringently. Yeah. Not too much in focus. So the whole pain gate with that peripheral and central modulation, it applies very nicely. It's the way pain signal is put together from the brain to the body, really, and from the body to the brain. So why not use that and the different tissues and addressing them, and different models like the APET model, APET, the activating agent, the pattern matching, the emotion or sensation, and thought, basically. And having those kind of models is helping us to not be focused on a solution, but we still have the ability to do it our way. Not everybody has to do it the same way, which is quite an interesting way. So it's quite, but whilst using our reason. So we need to be quite rational. We need to use our rational mind, basically. So we have sequenced the whole thing a little bit, and we leave it to you to be a bit imaginative about how you want to do it, because we're going to describe several techniques to do it, but there's hundreds out there. And as long as it applies for dealing with your organ, there's no problem at all. Or if that's the way for you to deal with your being a complete control freak or a status freak, and your status freakness, and for you to realize that the difference between how much status you have and how much status you think you have, and the discrepancy between the two, and you're able to diminish it, you can do it however you want. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really matter.
If it works for you, it works for you.
It works for you, that's it. There's no problem.
So the other word that we mentioned on the course that I thought could do with a bit of defining was Cartesian.
Cartesian. Yeah, so Descartes, René Descartes. Well, so we talk about modernism a little bit now. So we talk about the mid-1700s, where the Enlightenment, we come out of, it's not mid-1700s, it starts at the end of the Middle Age, so late 1500s, where So the end of the Ottoman Empire, or the discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus. So there's a big change in terms of religion, there's a big change in terms of commerce or possibilities, there's a big change into the method, the scientific method. We start to put that into place. Galileo, Galilei, all those guys, Copernicus, like Newton, all those big guys like Bernoulli, Lavoisier, all those complete nutcases who've organized the whole stuff and have thought about things that we don't seem to think too much about nowadays, really. But our society is really built onto that, really. Okay, so René Descartes was one of those, and we, I think, look at that Cartesian way of thinking because there's that rational way and that sequential way of doing the whole lot a little bit. So we tend to use our left brain, if we could summarize it like that, really. But maybe the oracle has got a much more articulate way of describing it, really. But it's really a certain way of thinking that uses your rational mind, I would say, and which is your left brain, and it sequences it really nicely, really.
Yeah, well, define Cartesian says relating to Descartes and his ideas.
That's it.
Let's see
what Descartes' ideas were. But I think there's a dualism.
Yeah,
there's quite a lot.
Cartesian dualism.
That's it, exactly.
Division of something conceptually into two opposed or contrasted aspects, or the state of being so divided.
That's it. So, and Cartesian, I think we applied it on our course because of the mind-body being two separate entities, basically. When actually we are definitely of the school of thought in our course, and in light of that polyvagal theory especially, and Mr. Porges, which is absolutely excellent, and I think it's a bit revolutionary to look at the brain and the body, or at being bidirectional feedback mechanisms. Your body informs your brain, and your brain informs your body in a way, and it works both ways. So we can't.
It's like
So yeah. So and I guess after the whole Cartesian dualism like that, I think there is a part of it where is the mind in the brain. So yes, the vagus nerve is going to influence your brainstem and maybe bring that to your higher centers. So it's really the brain in a way. And that is going to maybe help you to be a bit more conscious about things. So after this consciousness discussion under the whole lot, we are not having ontological discussions too much about the stuff, or philosophical discussion about the stuff and what consciousness is, because I don't know if anybody knows what consciousness is anyway. But the fact that Cartesian way of looking at things, and what I tend to refer a lot of the time about the tissue causing pain, and the focus there is on the tissue causing pain, and the diagnosis about things tends to really stifle people's ability when in persistent pain. Because obviously, when you got pain in your arm and you're very short of breath and you got crushing pain in your chest and you're getting blue and your lips are purple and you're passing out, obviously a diagnosis of a heart attack is actually quite an interesting thing to do. So we know what to do next, really, okay? And nitric oxide might be quite a good thing under your tongue to dilate a bit your coronary arteries, no doubt. Okay, but when it comes to persistent pain, a diagnosis is far less relevant compared to the experience people have of things, really, okay, of the whole thing in their life, individually, in a way, because it doesn't apply to everybody the same, okay? So I think that's where we wanted to go with that Cartesian way of thinking, and that mostly that division between the mind and the body, in a way, really. Or the brain and the body.
Or addressing that division and readdressing it as a whole.
A whole. That's it. It's a one thing.
Yeah.
It's a one mechanism. And your body informs your brain, and your brain informs your body.
Yeah.
And maybe your mind plays some part in that whole aspect of it.
So it's about, on
Somehow.
the course, every time you talk about you always talk about coming away from the Cartesian way of thinking.
That's it. To try to make it a all-encompassing process, really.
When we're talking about persistent or chronic pain.
Chronic, that's it. Even like the whole chronic aspect of it and things like that. Anyway, the way we define it is quite an important thing, really.
Those were the only three that I got down.
You got down, that's it. All the rest, everybody was really, we were quite clear about it already.
We'll see.
That's it.
We'll find out. We haven't put anything
Thank God
out.
the Oracle was there to put us back in the straight and narrow a little bit, really.
Yeah,
But
always.
yeah, so no, I guess we might have to include a little glossary and bits and bobs or links.
I'm sure there'll be more.
Links to.
I'm sure there'll be a
to the
number
stuff,
of
really, but-
definition videos that we need to do.
Yeah.
Why? I know we've spoken about this before, but I might just get you to try and explain it again. Why is it that you like to call it persistent pain, not chronic?
Yeah, so the chronic pain is something that never ends. It's chronic. It's like a never-ending process, basically. Compared to a persistent, it's finite in time. Basically, it might last a long time, but there's a possibility of an end to the whole lot. When it's chronic, it means there's no end to it.
Yeah.
So that's it. It's
it's setting the scene of the story to be.
That's it. To
be
be defined,
never-ending.
and it enables people who suffer from persistent pain to become chronic pain sufferers. And therefore they tend to have a lot of secondary gain from that. Despite being in lots of pain, they got secondary gain because it defines them, really. So the pain becomes part of them, really. When actually it should be only... They become a chronic pain warrior, basically, or whatever you want to call yourself, really. But some people having sciatica is just an annoyance as part of the rest of their life, in a way, really. And they are not defined by their sciatica. They are John Smith, who suffers from sciatica. That's it. He's not a sciatica sufferer, really. In that way of thinking, I think it's quite important, because
It's someone who suffers from something, not a sufferer who also does other things in life.
That's it.
Yeah. A sufferer trying to live rather than someone living who suffers.
That's it.
Yeah.
Which is really, it's a booby trap that we quite easily fall into. But I guess that's because pain has got really a very special position in even in philosophical in the philosophy or in our way of thinking, in our experience of life and things like that, really. You cannot tell somebody that the pain they experience is not real. That's the whole thing, because there's nothing more real than pain. That's the tricky part, really, and what we want to try to bring to people's attention is a bit the way our brain functions, or maybe our mind even function, and our consciousness is on about, and pain is quite central to that. The whole suffering process, the difficulty we have to go through a little bit, and a lot of people, especially, and we really like Jordan Peterson, who talks really elegantly and in a very articulate fashion about it, because he talks about all responsibility, how much the heaviest load you need to carry, and carrying a load is not an easy thing to do, and therefore you have to sweat a bit, you have to be uncomfortable, basically, and you need to be in an always uncomfortable position in order to be able to move forward, basically. And often thinking that if nothing changes, we're going to be in a comfortable position is maybe not true. and maybe a lot of us being stuck into who we are and what we do tends to create pain. That's the thing, really. And the pain is a driver for us to go forward, and or for others is to stop and to become a victim in a way, really. And
It's very easily. That's very easily
all
done.
that part, really, which is fine, really. So because it's ways of doing this, it's great to have different ways of doing about the whole thing, really. But
if you could be less heuristic about why you're experiencing pain,
That-
and maybe
a
draw a
bit
different conclusion rather than my body's just backfired and wrong.
maybe not
Something
heuristic, but
like
more Cartesian about the whole way, and splitting it a little bit. We want pain to be a bit like a meaning generating process,
Communicator.
a communicator, or something that asks for your attention or commands your attention. And the main pitfall we fall into is we focus on the tissue causing pain solely. And the tissue causing pain, when you can see your ankle bone because you've rolled it, it's obviously that it's broken. Okay, and your pain is not, you don't have a elbow pain when you just broken your ankle. Okay, so it's quite an accurate representation of something being broken, and that's the acute pain, and it's really involved with inflammation and swelling and decrease in mobility and heaps of pain. Okay, and tissue damage. But down the line, 6 or plus weeks later, if you still have pain in your ankle, it's not solely the tissue causing pain that your brain or your mind is commanding you to pay attention to. It's as well, what is it you use your ankle for? So maybe you can't play tennis anymore. Why would playing tennis be such a thing you need to pay attention to? Because maybe you play doubles, so there's 4 people involved. Maybe you go a bit of a social after you've been playing tennis. Maybe you meet other people. You go to David Lloyd's, wherever, and then you have a little beer with everybody, and you natter about the whole lot and things. So you have a bit of meaningful relationship with other people. But during the game, you completely lose yourself, so you can de-stress yourself really well, and it flows. Time tends to vanish or shrink or whatever, and you're part of a community because it's a group, and then maybe you go on holiday with them. In the summer, you go on a tennis camp or whatever. You can go to Dubrovnik because they do that you can travel, all those kind of stuff. That's what your ankle reminds you, and the pain in your ankle reminds you of. It's what you can do and what you could do with your ankle. So the ankle bone and your distal anterior tibiofibular ligament discomfort is one thing. Yeah, great. But we have to stop thinking solely like that, really. We need to add a bit of breadth and meaning to the whole lot. So another way of defining the pain in your ankle is what is it preventing you of doing? Or what is it enabling you of doing? Because you can whinge and be with your crutches or in your wheelchair and get attention from people, and people, poor you, and saying, and therefore you get loads of attention, because that enables you something as well. If it prevents you from doing something, it enables you to do something. And it's not super clear sometimes whether the thing that it prevents you doing is a bad thing. It could be actually quite a very good thing, and what it enables you to do is maybe not such a good thing. Anyway, that's a different thing. And then there's a third level which is quite an interesting thing, which adds a bit more information and a bit more meaning, is the archetypal part of it, really. So what is it all the humans have been doing since we are humans with their ankle? What is it you do with your hip? What is it humans do with their hips? What is it? What does it mean to have a hip? How is it? What is the metaphor behind your neck? A human neck. What is it we do with our neck? What is it you do with your wrist or your hand? What is it you do with your eyes or your ears or, I don't know, your shoulder, for example? So there is as well a bit to do with that really, and it helps you to define some a bit more human attributes and psychological processes at play in order to, which are a bit more, which helps you to resolve even more precisely what could be happening to you really, and what you have to pay attention to really. So the hip or the knee is a perfect thing. The knee is great really, because when you got knee pain, you share with the 7 billion people on earth a knee, two knees actually. So there's 14 billion knees, which is quite an interesting thing. And now that we know there's more people living on earth today than there's ever been since man has been man. So we could double that. So there was 28 billion knees. You know, so far, in a way, because there might be a bit more in the future already, okay? Obviously. But it means that archetypally, we've had to contend with the symbolic behind and the metaphor behind what the knee does. And I always tend to tell people, even to go back to a bit of a lower resolution about the tissue causing pain, I'm always like, well, where is your knee really? If it's not between your hip and your ankle, I'm not too sure where it is really. And it's not so much stating the obvious really, okay? And your knee is really enabling you to change the shape of your leg, which sounds really daft really, but it means you have to pay attention to change. Maybe. So it would be like your ability to focus on what is it humans do with their knees, in a way. And it's becoming even quite peculiar with that, really, because you come out of your house with a bad knee and you can see everybody who's got a bad knee. And the day before having a bad knee, you could not see people with a bad knee. It's quite peculiar, really. So let's say you want to stop eating cake, or it's January. You need to be vegan.
Or dry.
Or dry, exactly, dry January. So you don't drink any alcohol. On January the 2nd, there's some people in the street with beer cans drinking in front of you, and you can see only alcohol. You pass all the pubs, you can notice inside the pub people pouring pints, all the rest. Your brain is focused on a thing you can't really get, really. In a way, it was quite a peculiar thing, really. You must see a lot of slaughterhouses when you go vegan, really. You must be even more people in a restaurant. You must see only people eating steak around you, or the rest, really, which must be quite interesting in a way. Okay,
you're hyper aroused by certain things,
and you pay even more attention to that, really.
Yeah.
Okay?
Every time someone first mentions they've seen a new car on the new registration plate.
That's it.
Walk out of, pretty much, it happens every time, walk out of where I've just had that conversation.
That's it.
And the new plate goes by.
Because you're more wanting to pay attention, not wanting, but you pay attention to it a bit more, really. When actually beforehand, it had not been brought to your attention, basically. So pain is really great because it brings a lot of things to our attention. It commands you to pay attention to all those different layers. And the the chondromalacia retropatellae is interesting. And the tracking of your kneecap is great.
What was the translation of what you just said?
So chondromalacia retropatellae. So it's the wear of the cartilage behind your kneecap. Okay, because of your tracking. So it's quite a common thing with women more than men. Because of the Q angle. Because that's it, really. Men don't give birth to children, to babies. It's really so unfair. So unfair. I'm really beside myself.
Yeah.
But so women suffer more from cartilage damage behind their kneecap because of the Q angle, and the way their pelvis is put together is a bit wider, which actually increases the angle at the knee, and vastus lateralis and intermedialis and all the part of the quadriceps is actually pulling your kneecap outwards. and you got only your vastus medialis to bring it in. And therefore, on the condyle, the kneecap should really work quite well, but because it's slightly pushed to the lateral part of it, it tends to wear more readily, basically. Okay? So, yeah, that's what you need to pay attention to. And you need to change the tracking of your kneecap, which is great, really. But you need to pay attention to, all of a sudden, you have to change the tracking of your kneecap. So you have to change. And the knee is about changing the shape of your leg. And it's enabling you to put one foot in front of the other. So it enables you to go forward. So if you are not having a very good knee, you might not be able to change yourself well enough in order to put one foot in front, in order to go forward, really. Okay? So people with bad knees tend to have to pay attention to all that. If they want to maybe have to pay attention to less to their knee, really, in a way.
And have attention to spend or pay on other things that they would rather pay.
But that's it. So that's where we talk about the Tower of Babel a little bit in that scripture, and the transformative type thing. It brings a bit of chaos a little bit to have different languages spoken, which actually capsizes or prevents the venture to actually be finalized.
To be successful.
Successful, basically, okay? And that's your body, the language. If we were to look at pain and the body part as a language, and like the definition of the language as underlying meaning to a sentence, you could have even a metaphorical meaning to the sentence that's got word is needing to be organized in a grammatical fashion, and words are made of letters, and letters have to be sequenced in a certain fashion to make a word. So you got you need to really go into a bit of a focus part or a broader part. And I think the pain you're experiencing and the way you can sequence it tends to really help you to figure out how to make it better, basically, and to have to pay attention to something else, really.
And so the Tower of Babel example is like the story of the Tower of Babel is people building a tower to heaven, and then is it that God changes everyone's language, or and then divides the language up, and so they can't communicate and they can't finish the tower.
That's it.
So they can't get to heaven. So the idea in this case is that pain is a language that maybe we don't understand individually
as well as we could, or in as precise or at different level at the different level of a language.
And in some ways painkillers are preventing us from figuring out how to communicate in the story of Tower of Babel or with pain.
Yeah, because we don't really want to get close to God. We want to have some headspace.
Yeah,
that's the whole self, really. Because headspace is enabling us to figure out.
Maybe for some people,
not only one problem.
That metaphorically would be getting close to God, because not having much headspace is pretty tiring.
But no, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. So the pain focuses your attention onto the one thing, and it commands quite a lot of attention from your brain to pay attention to that part, to the way you use that part, and to how everybody else uses that part, or in a metaphorical fashion, in a way, okay? And therefore, all that headspace cannot be used to do something else, because it might not be in your life if you've got problem with change, if you got problem with going forward, and if you got problem with your knee, and if you have to pay attention to all the others who've got the same weakness than you, all of a sudden you don't have much, you must have quite a fair bit to deal with, really. And the attention you have to pay to all that is preventing you from watching the daisies and the dandelions and the fluffy clouds, really. And therefore, it's not, your experience of reality is maybe a bit restricted, basically. When actually, the path or the journey is interesting, but we want it to get easier and easier because we get better at solving problem on a different definition of acuity. So we get a bit more focused on the whole thing, a bit broader, a bit more focused, a bit broader. Or I tend to talk about like the forest and the tree in the read really. So you can pay attention to just the one tree and you forget, and the forest is in completely blurred thing. You don't even see the trees in the forest really. When actually being able to zoom out away from that tree and to be able to see there's a forest, there's lots of more trees to focus on really. That's the main problem really.
Both have their benefits.
And both have their benefits really. That's the thing really. But being focused and being completely drawn towards just the one tree is difficult, and that's the whole diagnosis problem really.
I've got
fibromyalgia. So yes, you end up looking at just the one tree.
The fibromyalgia
tree, when actually fibromyalgia is many trees. That's the problem really.
And it's also probably right next to a lot of other different chronic trees.
That's it.
And so there's, instead of it just being, let's say, I suffer from fibromyalgia, maybe there's a lot of similarities to other people who have been diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome or something similar.
Yeah. Or post-viral or something like that. And depending on how we define it and how we diagnose it really. But it doesn't reflect so much the individual experience of people when they have it, and it doesn't help them to figure out how to get out of it. Because you become really good at knowing the tree you're focusing on all the time, and you get a little bit hooked on how the tree smells and tastes and feels and how it looks, all the rest really, and you get hooked on it really. You get very good at being, I don't know if but it's difficult sometimes to really look at it from that fashion really, because we could talk about seronegative rheumatoid conditions. We could talk about loads of things that we don't quite know how triggered they are really, the etiology of it really, in a way really. And many etiologies of seronegative rheumatoid conditions is to do with gut infection or something like that. So you get like giardia, or you get like a tummy bug or something like that, E. coli, something like that, and then you get really quite poorly, and then when you recover from that, you get your immune system is attacking your joints really. So it becomes quite interesting really. And then
that's a bit of a different
but the immune system, it can be seen like a little bit your personality, because it's dealing with others. HLA, human leukocyte antigen, is self non-self. A rheumatoid condition is your immune system attacking yourself. So it's not too far from thinking that the metaphorical representation of that is quite an interesting thing. There's something you can't stand in you, maybe, and therefore you want to destroy it, and therefore your immune system is turned towards it, really.
It's doing the same.
It's doing the same, really, in a way, okay? And it would be quite interesting to look at a few researches, or to have a few researches, I'm not too sure if they are or not, about maybe psychiatric profiles and immune system. I don't know, like people who are really aggressive, really angry, and things like that, could have maybe quite a powerful part of their immune system who's going to attack things really efficiently. But people who are a little bit more shy and a bit, or people who are depressed, maybe a little bit, maybe would it diminish a bit their immune system? Oh, maybe. Because we talk about DHEA or cortisol. So we talk about the adrenal function being linked to the humoral or cellular mediated immune system. And we talked about, with the expectation fulfillment theory of dream, we talk about expectation when unfulfilled are seen by your brain as a threat, and it puts load to your autonomic nervous system, and after a while you get less cortisol or less DHEA. And the DHEA and the cortisol manage your immune system. oh, maybe there could be a link there directly, really. So it could be quite interesting. And it always sounds a bit far-fetched because it's good to be able to be a victim. It simplifies the whole lot, really. Well, I got a tummy bug and I've got rheumatoid condition and poor me, and which is true because it's not really nice, really, to have it, really, and it's quite painful and it's quite restrictive in what you can do, and it's a comorbidity factor to lots of other things, and the inflammation there is and things. So the type of medication you're gonna get, all the rest, but all the attention you have to pay to that prevents you from paying attention to other things that might be as important to pay attention to in order to be understanding a bit how come it happened to you, which is quite an interesting thing, the epigenetic part of it and things. So the whole, that's another thing we could have defined. It was determinism a little bit, how deterministic it is. So I was lifting a really heavy thing and my disc went and I'm in loads of pain in my back. So lifting creates bad back. Okay. I sit all day long at the desk and I've got really bad back. Sitting at desks really buggers people back. My job is creating my bad back. No. Nope. Sorry, nope. Not only. More likely, the fact that you are not mitigating the effect the occupation is having onto your back is more an interesting thing because it reopens the whole thing. You have to now figure out a bit more. Compared to the conclusion you had drawn just now, was completely closing the whole perspective.
Which isn't very helpful, having that closed perspective, because usually that means someone carries on blaming their job, or they might change their job into something new, but
but they still need a job.
Might have the same issues.
That's it.
And pretty much no matter what job you do, you're going to have to figure out how to
mitigate
some of
the effect, the whole occupation you're having and your 8 hour a day is having on your body. And if you're not doing that, it's going to be difficult, really.
So the Oracle says about determinism, says the doctrine that all of events, including human action, are ultimately determined by causes regarded as external to the will.
That's it.
Some philosophers have taken determinism to imply that individual human beings have no free will and cannot be held morally responsible for their actions.
That's it. How convenient. You might as well, that's where bridges were built, I think, so you can top yourself up. You might as well, really, because
no, it's not my action,
and it's not even your fault because you just tripped and it was
there.
It was your left foot. It was your left foot fault. Yeah. I don't know. It's that's it. So
there's benefits to that kind of way of thinking, right? At times,
yeah. Why not?
But
it closes things a lot. You don't have any free will, and it's not your fault. You have no responsibility to anything that is happening to you. You're just a passive receiver of events, which everybody else is responsible. You can blame everybody else for the whole lot and have no responsibility for it yourself. I'm not too sure if it's really helpful. But that's my way of thinking, and I guess it would be great to have people who really think that, to discuss that with them, and to see how fulfilling their life is in a way, and how much things they have to complain about, and how much things I have to complain about. Compared to that's the thing, really. Despite it's all gonna happen to us, but feeling like you're the master of your own destiny and you're responsible for all those things is great. Oh, you're so lucky! You're going on a holiday. You're going traveling. How lucky do you have to be to go traveling? No, you have to put the time aside, you have to save the money, you have to know where you're going, you have to know how to pack your luggage, you need to know how to get to the freaking airport, take the plane or the bus or the boat and things like that. So it's actually, it's nothing to do with luck really, in a way. And anyways, is that way of thinking, which is really quite, in my very simplistic view of the whole thing, it's quite a limiting view of reality, and being deterministic in your view tends to maybe not be as fulfilling, and the journey isn't really as, because there's only one go at it. That's the shittiest part really. Being deterministic, if you had 2,392 lives, not a problem. Okay, the problem is you got only one life, as far as we're concerned, or as far as we know so far. Not many people know how many lives they've had, type thing. But as far as we're concerned, we have only one life, and limiting the journey with a deterministic way of thinking is, well, maybe a bit of a shame, maybe. But there's different ways of looking at it, I guess.
Always.
So responsibility is the key, in my opinion, and that enables you to open up to your view of the future a little bit and embrace it. Take the highest load you can, the heaviest load you can. Try to move your knee to change the shape of your leg so you can put one foot in front of the other. So you do more step forwards than you do backwards. A little bit.
That'll be a good way to go. Good direction.
Good direction. It's not easy, but we've got only one go at it. That's the main thing, really. And if we could, maybe that's the education part of it, really. And yeah, our course is going to be based quite a lot on that, really. It's for people who want to take responsibility and they want a little help to have a framework that makes it a little bit easier, because we've gone through a bit the thinking and through the hurdles. So some of us have. Some of us do faster than others. Some of us are a bit slower at it. But nonetheless, everybody's own rhythm, and having a good framework to be able to deal with something as fundamental as pain and suffering, to my opinion, is quite an attractive prospect, basically. It's quite an interesting prospect. But I'm maybe biased about the whole thing, really. And maybe I'm not in enough pain to know about it, really. And maybe I've not been in enough pain. So we go back to what Alex Stanfield, our psychotherapist extraordinaire, was talking about, Caron and the wounded healer, really. Are you good at... are you able to heal people if you've been really buggered yourself, really? You know, if you're crippled, really. Is it because you're crippled that you can help people better, really? And you can, I don't know, like, empathize with them and really understand them and know what they've gone through a little bit, really. But it's really thinking that you haven't suffered at all in your life, when actually... well, it would be good to go on a search, really, maybe, and find the one person who's never suffered in his entire life, really. That would be quite interesting, really.
Maybe suffering's just relative to the
beholder a little bit, really. And Alec was saying he had it quite easy, but maybe it's because his glass is quite half full, basically.
And it's been that way for quite a while, maybe.
And it's been that way for quite a while, really. Yeah. And he's been taking responsibility for quite a while, and he's been learning about how to deal with certain dialectic for quite a while. And therefore, when those dialectic come about, it's not a problem anymore, really, because he knows how to deal with them. That's it, really. So, I don't know. It's just... we tend to repeat the same thing again and again and again, really.
Yeah, but I think we get better at talking about it.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff.
Yeah.
Should we end it there?
Yeah, perfect. Good job.
Oui.
That was a bit more about definitions, but when I start, I can't really stop.
Well, that's exactly why we do it.
That's it.
Otherwise, it would only be 5 minutes, and I'm pretty sure most people
that's it.
want at least an hour of listening to you.
That's it. Loving it.
Cool. Thanks, Alexei.
No worries, thank you.